I'm Eleanor Hayes, 36 years old now, and for the first time in my life I can breathe without waiting for permission. But this peace didn't come cheap. It was bought with years of silence, obedience, and a final betrayal so sharp it sliced through every illusion I ever had about family. Before I begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more real-life stories that prove sometimes the family we build means more than the one we're born into. I was born in a small town called Ridgeview, a place where front porches were polished as often as reputations. My parents, Harold and Diane Hayes, ran the town's only insurance agency and believed success was measured not in happiness, but in control. My father's word was law beneath our roof, and my mother enforced that law with smiles sharp enough to draw blood. From the outside, we looked perfect. Church every Sunday, honor roll certificates framed in the hallway, matching holiday sweaters for family photos. Inside, we walked on eggshells polished by expectation. My older brother Nathan was the golden child, captain of the debate team, future heir to my father's business, and the measure against which my worth was always found wanting. I was the quiet one, the artist who filled sketchbooks with faces no one wanted to see. My father once said that art was a nice hobby for bored housewives, but not a career for a Hayes. My mother nodded, as she always did, because disagreement was untidy, and our family did not do untidy. For years, I tried to shrink myself into their version of acceptable. Straight A grades, no talk of college outside our state, no friends my father hadn't personally approved. He said structure built character. What it built was fear. Every decision was a test, every mistake a trial. When Nathan lied about a car accident he'd caused senior year, my father paid off the damages and called it protecting the family name. When I forgot to attend a fundraiser banquet, he called me an embarrassment. It was always about the name, never the people who carried it. After high school, I earned a scholarship to an art institute 3 states away. My acceptance letter felt like oxygen. My father tore it in half before I could finish reading it. He said family came first and that I was needed at the agency. My mother handed me a cup of tea and told me to be grateful for his guidance. I learned then that gratitude can be a beautiful word for submission. For the next 10 years, I worked under the neon hum of the office sign, signing other people's policies while mine quietly expired. I watched Nathan rise through the company he'd been promised, his failures hidden, his successes celebrated as proof of our family's legacy. When clients complimented my attention to detail, my father said it was because I had nothing better to do than try to impress people. It took years to realize he was right. Not about my value, but about what I was trying to impress. Not people, but him. The breaking point came the year my father announced his retirement. He held a banquet at the country club to pass the torch to Nathan. I sat at the edge of the room, clapping as my brother accepted a company he'd never earned. When my father gave his speech about legacy and discipline, he said he was proud to see his son carry on his values. He did not mention his daughter once. After the toasts, he handed me an envelope, a gift for my years of service. Inside was a modest check and a contract renouncing my stake in the family business. He said it was for my own good, so I could pursue something more suitable for my temperament. What he meant was that I was no longer part of the picture. I left that night with nothing but my sketchbooks and a cheap used car Nathan mocked me for driving. It should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like a door finally opening after years of scratching at the lock. I did not know where I was going, only that I would never again ask for permission to exist. That was 10 years ago. What happened after would change everything. Not just for me, but for the people who once believed they owned my future. Leaving Ridgeview felt like stepping out of a photograph. The colors too bright, the smiles too fixed. I drove for hours with no destination except away. The radio played songs I didn't recognize, and each mile between me and that white house on Cedar Lane loosened something tight inside my chest. For the first time in 30 years, no one was watching. The silence felt both terrifying and holy. I ended up in a small coastal town called Brighton Bay. The air there tasted like salt and possibility. The streets were lined with weathered cottages and art galleries that smelled of paint and coffee. I found a room above a bakery, its window overlooking the harbor. The owner, Mrs. Calloway, offered a discount when she saw the sketchbook under my arm. "Artists bring luck," she said. No one in Ridgeview would have believed that. For weeks I drew every day. The sea and its shifting moods, the fishermen mending nets, children chasing gulls along the boardwalk. My hands ached, but it was the ache of living again. I sold my first painting to a tourist couple from Seattle. They paid me $200 and told me it reminded them of freedom. I smiled, though they couldn't have known how literal that word felt. Still, freedom came with its own kind of poverty. Rent consumed most of what I earned. Meals were simple, and some nights I traded sketches for bread from the bakery downstairs. Yet even hunger felt lighter than the weight of approval I'd once carried. I learned to live small, to be invisible by choice. My father's voice still haunted me. The way he said stability mattered more than passion. Each time I made enough to cover another month, I imagined him seeing that I hadn't fallen apart without his rules. The thought was its own quiet rebellion. After a year, I began to find rhythm in the solitude. My work evolved, no longer pretty seascapes for tourists, but raw studies of isolation and resilience. A gallery owner named Lena saw one of my pieces at a local exhibit and asked to display more. She said my art had emotional muscle. I didn't tell her it came from scars. Within months, I was earning enough to rent a proper studio, a converted boathouse that smelled of salt and turpentine. I called it the Salvage, because that's what it was, the place where I rebuilt what was left of me. When the first review appeared in a regional magazine, I bought 5 copies. The article called me "a quiet force transforming pain into beauty." My father would have dismissed it as sentimental nonsense, but the gallery sold out that weekend. Strangers began to write to me, saying my paintings made them feel less alone. For someone who'd spent her life unseen, that was a kind of resurrection. 2 years later, I received an invitation that made my stomach tighten, a group exhibition in the city sponsored by a major art foundation. My name printed beside artists I'd once studied in college catalogs I wasn't allowed to apply to. It felt like life itself was handing me a second chance. I poured everything I had into that show, each canvas a confession I'd never spoken aloud. When opening night came, I stood at the edge of the gallery, watching people study my work. No one knew who I was, and for once, that anonymity felt like power. A collector purchased my largest piece, Inheritance, a stormscape layered with torn contract pages embedded in the paint, remnants of the document my father had once forced me to sign. I didn't explain the symbolism. Art doesn't need permission to tell the truth. That exhibition changed everything. My paintings began traveling further than I ever had. To New York, Toronto, even London. Each sale chipped away at the shame I'd been taught to feel for wanting more than obedience. I wasn't rich, but I was respected. I wasn't perfect, but I was free. Then, one evening, as the sun bled over the harbor outside my studio, an email arrived that froze me. It was from a law firm in Ridgeview. The subject line read, "Estate Inquiry, Hayes Family Holdings." My father had passed away 2 weeks earlier. The message said my presence was requested for the reading of his will. I stared at the screen until the light outside turned to darkness. For years, I'd told myself revenge wasn't necessary, that silence was enough. But something inside me stirred. Not hatred exactly, but a hunger for truth, for balance. Maybe some debts could only be settled face to face. The next morning, I packed my suitcase. The train to Ridgeview left at dawn. As the station whistle echoed across the bay, I realized I wasn't returning to mourn my father. I was returning to reclaim the story he'd tried to erase. The train back to Ridgeview cut through fog and farmland, its windows reflecting fragments of a life I'd left behind. Each passing mile blurred the years of distance I'd worked so hard to build. I had imagined this return countless times, sometimes triumphant, sometimes vengeful, but the reality was quieter. Grief wasn't what I felt. What I felt was reckoning. When I stepped off the platform, the town looked almost unchanged. Same polished sidewalks, same careful hedges, same church bell marking the hour. Ridgeview had always been good at pretending time stood still. What had changed was me. I was no longer the obedient daughter arriving home for approval. I was the woman who'd learned to exist without it. The law firm sat across from the courthouse, a narrow brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and moral compromise. The receptionist asked if I was there for the Hayes estate, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution, as though she could sense the story beneath my composure. I nodded and waited in a room lined with certificates declaring other people's victories. Nathan arrived minutes later, tailored suit, expensive watch, the same easy confidence he'd worn since adolescence. He looked surprised to see me, though perhaps not displeased. Time had softened him, a few lines at the corners of his eyes, but his smile still carried the certainty of someone accustomed to winning. He greeted me with a warmth that felt rehearsed, the kind that photographs well at funerals. I replied politely, letting silence do what words could not. When the attorney entered, the air in the room shifted from polite to procedural. He spoke of assets and holdings, of charitable trusts and pending valuations. My father's life, reduced to ledgers and signatures. Nathan listened with the attentive ease of someone expecting reward. I, on the other hand, listened for absence, the things unsaid, the names omitted. When the attorney mentioned the agency, I knew before he finished the sentence. My father had left the entire company to Nathan. Not surprising. What caught me off guard was the rest: the family home, the stocks, the property portfolio. Every tangible proof of our family's legacy transferred neatly to my brother's name. And then, almost as an afterthought, the attorney produced a smaller envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting. Inside was a single key and a letter written on thick stationery that smelled faintly of his cologne. His words were precise, the way his reprimands had always been. He wrote that he hoped I had found peace with my artistic pursuits, and that, in recognition of my independent spirit, he was leaving me something of sentimental value: the storage unit behind the old agency building. He said he believed it contained reminders of my youthful ambitions. My youthful ambitions. The phrase landed like an insult wrapped in politeness. Nathan thanked the attorney, shook his hand, and asked about next steps. I stood motionless, the key pressed into my palm until its edges marked my skin. That small metallic weight carried every ounce of his control, even from the grave. Afterward, Nathan insisted we have coffee, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps curiosity. He spoke about the business, about expansion plans, about honoring our father's legacy. He used words like we and our, though the truth was clear. There was no we. There hadn't been for years. When he mentioned the art shows he'd heard about, I recognized the tone, admiration laced with condescension. He said I must be proud to have made something of myself in my own way. It was the kind of compliment that felt like a boundary being drawn. I left him at the cafe, the taste of bitter coffee lingering long after. The key in my pocket seemed to vibrate with unfinished business. I drove to the back lot of the old agency, where the building's facade still bore the gold letters, Hayes and Son Insurance. The sun glinted mockingly in the afternoon light. The storage unit sat behind it, half hidden by overgrown hedges. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the key. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old paper. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, labeled with dates and client names. In the corner, covered by a sheet, stood an easel. Mine. The one my father had confiscated when I was 17 after declaring that painting distracted me from useful pursuits. Beneath the sheet were my canvases, brittle but intact, along with sketchbooks I'd thought destroyed. On top of the pile rested an envelope labeled Unsent Letters, Eleanor. I opened it carefully. Inside were drafts of scholarship recommendations, gallery inquiries, even a partial application to the Art Institute. All in my father's handwriting, all unsent. He had filled them out, perhaps intending to support me once, then changed his mind. Each page was stamped with hesitation, the ghost of approval withheld. For years I had believed he'd never seen me at all. Now I realized he had seen me perfectly, and chosen silence instead of support. It wasn't ignorance, it was punishment. Standing in that dusty room, surrounded by relics of both suppression and proof, I felt no rage, only clarity. The past couldn't be rewritten, but it could be repurposed. My father's legacy would not end in that office or in Nathan's boardroom. It would end in light, on canvas, turned into something he could never control again. That night, I loaded the easel and boxes into my car. The key stayed behind, resting on the floor like an offering to ghosts. Ridgeview had taken enough from me. It was time to make it pay attention. Driving away from the agency that night, the horizon looked like a wound closing slowly. The lights of Ridgeview dimmed behind me until they were only reflections on my rearview mirror, fragments of a life I no longer owed anything to. The boxes in the back seat rattled with every turn, whispering the ghosts of years spent unseen. Inside them lay proof of everything my father had tried to contain. I didn't yet know what to do with it all, only that I wouldn't bury it again. When I returned to Brighton Bay, the familiar scent of salt air felt like forgiveness. My studio, the salvage, was waiting. Quiet, cluttered, honest. I laid the recovered sketches on the floor, one by one, like evidence at a trial. My teenage handwriting was still delicate, uncertain. I could see the girl I used to be in each shaky line, desperate to be allowed expression. It struck me how easily entire identities could be erased by parental disapproval. I had lived half my life believing my art had never mattered to him. The truth was worse. It had mattered enough for him to destroy it. For days, I painted without stopping. Sleep became secondary to the need to translate grief into color. The first canvas was called Inheritance 2, a continuation of the stormscape I'd once sold, but darker, more deliberate. I embedded torn pieces of my father's letters into the paint, the unsent recommendations dissolving into texture. It wasn't hatred that guided my hand, but reclamation. For once, I wasn't painting to be understood. I was painting to be free. The work that emerged over the following weeks was unlike anything I'd done before. Critics would later call it the Ridgeview Cycle, a series exploring generational control and emotional colonization. I called it survival. The pieces were raw, layered with fragments of insurance forms, family photographs, ledger pages, the tangible remains of a legacy built on appearance and silence. Each brushstroke felt like rewriting history from the inside out. Lena, my gallery partner, visited one afternoon and stood speechless before the canvases. She said they looked like confessions written in light. When I told her where the materials came from, she exhaled slowly and said it was the most honest work I'd ever made. She proposed a solo exhibition, one that would reveal not only the art, but the story behind it. I hesitated at first. The idea of exposing my family's private mythology felt dangerous, almost sacrilegious. But revenge, I was learning, doesn't always arrive as rage. Sometimes it comes disguised as truth, displayed for everyone to see. The show opened 6 months later in the city's main contemporary gallery. The invitation featured one of my father's old company ledgers, overlaid with paint, the Hayes logo barely visible beneath the texture. I arrived early on opening night, standing quietly as the crowd filtered in. People walked slowly through the space, faces contemplative, expressions shifting as they realized the narrative behind the art. I watched strangers read fragments of my father's handwriting embedded in color. The very words he'd once used to define me, now repurposed as art that defined him instead. When the reviews came, they were overwhelming. The Ridgeview Cycle was described as a haunting dissection of inherited control, a testament to endurance. Critics compared my transformation of pain into art to alchemy. One headline read, "Daughter turns patriarch's legacy into light." I clipped that one and pinned it above my work table. It felt like a verdict, not against a man, but against the myth he'd built. Nathan called 2 days later. His message was polite but heavy with tension. He said the family name was being dragged into uncomfortable attention. He suggested that I consider the public image implications. The irony made me laugh out loud, the same warning my father had once used as a weapon. I deleted the message without reply. My silence had finally become its own statement. The exhibition ran for 8 weeks and sold out completely. The final piece, the largest canvas, titled Obedience, was purchased by a museum in New York. It depicted a woman standing inside a house made of ledger paper, her silhouette dissolving into ocean light. The curator called it a visual metaphor for liberation. For me, it was simply the truth. I had built my freedom from the ruins of control. When the show closed, I returned to my studio with a sense of calm that felt unfamiliar. For the first time, my father's presence in my life had no power. Not in memory, not in art, not in name. Yet, as often happens when peace begins to settle, the past found one more way to intrude. A letter arrived at the gallery, forwarded from Ridgeview. The handwriting was unmistakable. Nathan's. Inside was a single sentence. "We need to talk." It's about Mother. Nathan's letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, thin but heavy in its quiet urgency. I turned it over in my hands for nearly an hour before opening it, as if the paper itself carried the weight of every unfinished conversation between us. His message had been brief, a plea more than a demand, but it stirred something I thought I'd already resolved, the part of me that still wanted to believe family could change. He wrote that our mother had fallen ill, heart failure, advancing quickly. He said she had been asking for me. Asking, not calling. The difference mattered. It meant she hadn't reached out herself, that perhaps pride still stood guard at her bedside. Yet curiosity, or maybe compassion disguised as anger, made me pack a small bag and drive back to Ridgeview once again. The town looked smaller this time, stripped of its power to intimidate. The streets that once dictated how I should walk and speak now felt like a stage set after the performance had ended. When I pulled into the driveway of the old house, its shutters were freshly painted, but the air around it felt tired, like a house rehearsing the memory of grandeur. I hesitated before knocking. My reflection in the brass doorplate looked like a stranger, the kind of woman my mother once warned me not to become. Independent, outspoken, unashamed. Nathan answered, his expression softer than I remembered. He looked worn, not from wealth or arrogance, but from carrying too much of both. He told me she was upstairs, resting, that the doctors weren't hopeful. I followed him through hallways that smelled of lemon polish and ghosts. Every family photo still hung in perfect alignment. My father in the center, Nathan at his side, my own image frozen at 17. No later photographs replaced it. I had been edited out by omission. Mother's room was dim, the curtains drawn to a sliver of afternoon light. She lay small against white pillows, her once impeccable hair now silver and thin. Time had carved her into someone almost gentle. When she opened her eyes and saw me standing there, a flicker of disbelief crossed her face before something fragile settled in. She said my name quietly, like testing whether it still belonged to me. I sat beside her bed, uncertain what role to play. Daughter, stranger, witness. She spoke slowly, each word measured by fatigue. She told me she had seen the newspaper articles about my exhibition. She said the paintings were beautiful, even if they revealed too much. I could hear both admiration and discomfort folded into the same sentence, her signature blend of praise and restraint. She said she hadn't realized how much pain my father had caused until he was gone, that sometimes silence can be its own cruelty. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she knew how to come. I wanted to tell her that I no longer needed apologies, that forgiveness had stopped being a currency I traded in. Instead, I told her that the paintings weren't about revenge. They were about survival. She closed her eyes then, a tear escaping down a face that had always feared imperfection. Perhaps, in her own way, she understood. Over the next days, I stayed longer than I planned. I cooked soup, sorted her medications, and listened as Nathan tried to maintain the illusion that everything was under control. He had inherited father's vocabulary: stability, duty, image. But it sounded tired now, as if he finally knew the cost of carrying someone else's script. Late one evening, he admitted that the business was struggling. The modern world had little use for legacy built on reputation alone. He asked how I had managed to build something lasting out of what our father had dismissed. I told him the truth. I had stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. Mother passed away quietly 3 nights later. No dramatic last words, no grand reconciliation, just a long exhale that sounded like release. The funeral was modest, far smaller than the spectacle my father's had been. People whispered that grief had humbled the Hayes family. I didn't correct them. Let them believe humility had been inherited. I knew better. Humility isn't genetic, it's earned through loss. After the service, Nathan stood beside me near the family plot, his shoulders slumped, his expensive suit wrinkled from the humidity. He said he wished things had been different. I said things were different. We were standing side by side without pretending anymore. He nodded, and for the first time since childhood, our silence felt companionable rather than competitive. That night I stayed in the old house one last time. I walked through each room as if performing an exorcism, touching walls that had once listened to my father's rules, breathing in the faint scent of my mother's perfume fading from the drapes. In her closet, I found a box labeled Eleanor, Keep. Inside were small things I had thought she'd thrown away. A ribbon from my first art fair, a postcard from the city, a photograph of me at 12 holding a paintbrush. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "She sees the world differently." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, the seed of something truer than the perfection she'd once worshipped. When dawn broke over Ridgeview, I locked the door behind me for the last time. The house didn't resist. It let me go. After the funeral, I drove straight to the coast without looking back. The highway unspooled beneath the tires like a ribbon finally cut free from ceremony. For the first few hours I felt nothing at all. Not relief, not sorrow, only the hollow exhaustion that follows the end of a long performance. Every mile that widened the distance between me and Ridgeview felt like air returning to my lungs. When I reached Brighton Bay, the tide was high, and the gulls circled low, crying like they knew the weight I carried. I unlocked my studio, stepped inside, and exhaled the kind of breath that belongs only to places that have waited for your return. The paintings stood where I had left them, mute witnesses to everything that had unfolded. For days I did nothing but sit among them, the silence thick enough to hear the hum of the sea beyond the walls. It wasn't grief I feared anymore. It was what comes after. The question of who you are once the war ends. I began to paint again, but this time the colors softened. Gone were the violent reds and storm grays of the Ridgeview cycle. In their place came muted blues, honeyed whites, the pale gold of late afternoon light. I called the new series Reclamation. Each canvas started with an underlayer of black, then gradually filled with translucent color until the darkness became part of the luminosity instead of its enemy. It was not about revenge now, it was about integration, how even broken things can glow if the light finds them at the right angle. Letters began arriving from strangers who had seen the earlier work. Some were artists, others simply people who had survived different kinds of silence. They thanked me for painting what they could not say. One woman wrote that she left an abusive marriage after seeing Obedience at the museum. She said the figure trapped in paper walls looked exactly how she had felt. I kept her letter pinned above my desk as a reminder that pain, when transformed, becomes permission for others to heal. Lena suggested hosting workshops for women who wanted to express their own stories through art. At first I refused. I wasn't a teacher, I told her, and I feared turning my sanctuary into a classroom. But the idea lingered like music you can't unhear. A month later, I opened the doors of the salvage to 8 women of varying ages and histories. We painted together in silence at first, then gradually the air filled with quiet conversation, confessions disguised as color choices, laughter surfacing where there had once been shame. By the end of the 6-week course, the walls of the studio glowed with hundreds of small canvases. Looking at them, I realized that this was what survival looked like multiplied, not a single voice reclaiming itself, but a chorus. News of the program spread, and donations began arriving anonymously. One morning, I found an envelope slipped under the door containing a bank check large enough to expand the workshops year-round. The signature at the bottom made my hands shake. It was Nathan's. No note, no conditions, just quiet participation. For the first time in our shared history, he had acted without control attached. I didn't call to thank him. Gratitude didn't feel like the right word. Instead, I sent him one of my smaller paintings, a horizon washed in silver and blue, and wrote on the back, "Some distances heal better when left open. Months folded into seasons." The studio became a second home for people rebuilding their lives from fragments. I learned to listen more than speak, to guide without correcting, to trust that art didn't need perfection to matter. Each session began with the same line I had once told myself: "We start where the silence ends." And every time someone picked up a brush, I felt the ghost of my father's voice fade a little more. Success followed quietly. A documentary crew filmed our workshops for an arts and healing series. The local paper called me the woman who turned generational control into collective freedom. Those words would have embarrassed the younger version of me, but now they simply felt accurate. Revenge had done its job, not by destroying what hurt me, but by making sure its cruelty created the opposite of itself. Still, late at night, when the tide pressed against the rocks and the world fell silent, I sometimes thought of my parents. I imagined them standing together somewhere beyond time, watching as the daughter they once tried to mold built something neither of them could have envisioned. I didn't picture anger on their faces anymore, only understanding, perhaps even pride, the kind that comes too late but still matters. By the following spring, the waiting list for the salvage workshops stretched across the country. Every name on it felt like a promise that stories buried in shame can surface as beauty. And maybe that was my real inheritance, not the business, not the estate, but the ability to turn what once confined me into something that freed others. By the time the salvage workshops reached their second anniversary, what had begun as a quiet act of reclamation had grown into something larger than I could have imagined. Newspapers called it a movement. The walls of the studio that once held only my grief now carried the fingerprints of hundreds of survivors, women and men who had painted their way through loss, guilt, and silence. Each brushstroke felt like a small defiance against the lives that had tried to contain them. I never sought fame. I only wanted freedom, but freedom, once found, has a way of echoing louder than you intend. One morning, an email arrived from the National Museum of Modern Expression. They were curating an exhibit called Inherited Voices, a collection focused on artists who transformed generational trauma into creation. They wanted my work to headline it. The curator wrote that my pieces embodied the courage of survival without the bitterness of vengeance. I read that line twice, letting it settle. Courage without bitterness. It was everything I had spent years learning to balance. The exhibition would open in Washington, D.C., then travel to 5 other cities, including the state capital closest to Ridgeview. I accepted, not for pride, but because part of me wanted Ridgeview to see what silence had built. In the months leading up to the opening, I painted one final piece, the Ledger Burns. It was massive, nearly 10 feet wide, a swirling composition of ash-colored strokes and faint traces of gold beneath layers of smoke gray. In its center, I embedded a single line from my father's old business letterhead: "Integrity and trust, since 1972. The irony wasn't cruel, it was historical. The truth, written in reverse. When the exhibit premiered, I stood quietly in the gallery corner, watching as people drifted from painting to painting. The room was bright, flooded with natural light, as if refusing to allow shadows to linger. Visitors leaned closer to read the embedded fragments: policy numbers, signatures, family photos, the artifacts of a life I'd once thought meaningless. Reporters asked about my family, about Ridgeview, about whether the Hayes name had inspired the title Inherited Voices. I told them the truth. It wasn't about one family, but about what happens when love is confused with control. The reviews were generous. National newspapers called the collection a visual act of generational repair. Museums requested long-term loans. Overnight, I became what critics like to call an artist of consequence. But fame, I learned, doesn't heal. It only amplifies what's already resolved. A few weeks later, as the exhibit moved to the state capitol, I received a message from the museum coordinator. A delegation from Ridgeview had requested a private tour. My first instinct was refusal. The past had taken enough space already. But curiosity, quiet and insistent, made me agree. They arrived on a Sunday morning before the doors opened. The mayor, a few local patrons, and at the back of the group, Nathan. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. He looked older again, not in age but in weight. Running the family business had weathered him in ways pride could not conceal. When our eyes met, something wordless passed between us, a recognition of two survivors of the same storm. As we walked through the gallery, he stayed slightly behind the others, reading every plaque, studying each painting as if memorizing an unfamiliar language. When we reached the ledger burns, he stopped in front of it for a long time. The light from the skylight flickered across his face, highlighting the struggle between discomfort and understanding. After the tour ended, he lingered as the others left, then approached slowly. He didn't apologize, not in words. But he said he wanted to make a donation in our parents' names to the Salvage Foundation. I told him he didn't need to, but he insisted. "Maybe it's not about need," he said. "Maybe it's about acknowledgement." His phrasing was deliberate, as if he had borrowed it from the language of my paintings. When the funds arrived weeks later, I used them to open a new wing at the studio, a glass addition overlooking the sea. On its entrance wall, I placed a bronze plaque inscribed with 3 words: "For every unspoken." I didn't add the Hayes name. The gesture wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about release. The press called the expansion a triumph. I called it equilibrium. That summer, as the waves lapped against the shore outside my studio, I began to understand something simple and unglamorous. Revenge, when done right, doesn't look like victory. It looks like peace that no one else can disturb. Still, stories have a way of circling back to where they began. One evening, a letter arrived, stamped from Ridgeview's town hall. It wasn't from Nathan this time. It was from the local historical society. They wanted to host a retrospective of the Hayes family legacy, and they were inviting me to contribute. For a long time, I stared at the letter in disbelief. Then I laughed quietly, the sound equal parts irony and release. The town that once erased me now wanted to display what I had built from its ashes. I didn't yet know what my answer would be, but I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever I gave them wouldn't be what they expected. The invitation from the Ridgeview Historical Society sat on my desk for nearly a week before I decided to respond. At first, I thought about ignoring it, letting silence do the talking as it always had. But something about the letter's phrasing kept echoing in my mind. To honor the legacy of the Hayes family and its contributions to our community. Legacy. It was the same word my father had worshipped, the altar at which we had all once been required to kneel. Maybe it was time to reclaim even that. I agreed to attend, but only on one condition, that the exhibition include a new installation I would personally curate. The committee accepted immediately, no doubt expecting sentimental tributes or framed photographs from the family archives. They didn't understand that my version of legacy was not about preservation. It was about truth. Returning to Ridgeview again, I noticed how the town seemed smaller each time, its symmetry less impressive now that I no longer lived inside its rules. Even the air felt staged. Manicured lawns, tidy sidewalks, the same church bell ringing as though no one had aged since I left. I stayed at a small inn near the outskirts instead of the family home, which had been sold after my mother's passing. Nathan had moved to the city, and the old house now belonged to strangers. I drove past it only once, slow enough to notice the curtains were open and laughter drifted faintly through the windows. It struck me as fitting that happiness had finally entered through doors once guarded by silence. The day of the event arrived beneath a sky so clear it almost looked deliberate. The town hall had been transformed into a small museum for the occasion. Photographs of Ridgeview's founding families lined the walls, interspersed with displays of old ledgers, civic awards, and faded newspaper clippings celebrating local milestones. At the center stood a section devoted entirely to the Hayes name, a curated narrative of respectability, my father shaking hands with bankers, my mother hosting fundraisers, Nathan receiving business awards. It was spotless, sterile, and wrong. My contribution occupied the final corner of the room, separated by a white curtain. Visitors moved through the main exhibit first, admiring the nostalgia, before stepping into mine. The installation was simple, 3 panels suspended in glass. The first contained a reproduction of my father's business letterhead, but the words had been burned away, leaving only faint outlines. The second displayed my mother's handwritten recipes and event notes, her perfect penmanship dissolving into watercolor. The third, the heart of it, held my teenage sketchbook, the one I had found years earlier in the storage unit, opened to the page where I had drawn the house on Cedar Lane, surrounded by rain. Above it, etched into the glass, were the words, "Some inherit houses. Others inherit silence." No music played. No spotlight dramatized the work. Just quiet space, an invitation for people to feel the truth without instruction. I watched from a distance as residents filed through. At first there was confusion, then discomfort, and finally stillness. Even the whispers fell away. When people emerged on the other side of the curtain, their expressions were different, subdued, thoughtful, as though they had glimpsed something private and real. Nathan arrived late. He stood before the panels longer than anyone else, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. I could tell he was reading the inscription again and again, absorbing it not as accusation, but as recognition. When he turned toward me, there was no defensiveness in his eyes, only understanding, maybe even gratitude. He said the exhibit was honest, that it was time someone told the story as it truly was. I told him honesty had always existed. It had just been inconvenient. He smiled faintly, and for once, it wasn't the smile of a victor. It was the smile of someone finally unburdened. Later, during the closing remarks, the head of the Historical Society thanked me for contributing such a personal perspective to the Hayes legacy. The audience applauded politely, but I caught the hesitation in their clapping, the subtle discomfort of people realizing that history, once rewritten, cannot be tidied back into legend. As the crowd dispersed, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. She introduced herself as a teacher from Ridgeview High. She said she'd brought her students because they were studying narrative truth in modern art. She thanked me for showing them that legacy doesn't have to mean perfection. Her words felt like closure disguised as conversation. When I left the hall, twilight had settled over the town square. The courthouse clock chimed 6 times, echoing softly through the air. I stood there for a long moment, watching the streetlights flicker on, the same streets where I had once hurried home afraid of being seen. Now, I stood still, unafraid, unhidden. The revenge I'd imagined years ago, dramatic, scorching, definitive, had melted into something quieter and far more powerful. Vindication, I realized, isn't loud. It's the silence that follows when truth no longer needs to defend itself. That night, I returned to Brighton Bay with the windows down, the cool wind tangling my hair. The road behind me didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like perspective. The following months unfolded like the slow exhale after years of holding my breath. The Ridgeview exhibition became a small sensation online. Photographs of the 3 suspended panels circulated across social media, captioned with the phrase etched in glass, "Some inherit houses. Others inherit silence." People wrote that it felt like a mirror held up to generations, that they saw their own families in the emptiness between the panels. It was strange watching strangers understand something that had once belonged only to me. Requests for interviews arrived daily, but I turned most of them down. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. Symbols are tidy, and my story had never been that. Still, one request stood out, a producer from a documentary series called Reclaimed Lives. They wanted to film an episode about the salvage and my journey from Ridgeview exile to national recognition. At first, I hesitated. The idea of cameras intruding on the fragile piece I had built made me uneasy. But then I thought of the women in the studio, their voices rising in laughter as they painted through their histories. Maybe it wasn't about me anymore. Maybe the story needed to belong to others now. Filming began in early spring. The crew was small and respectful, led by a director who spoke little and listened much. They followed our workshops, recorded interviews with students, and captured the sea through the large windows of the studio. Watching the footage later, I realized how serene the space had become. The ocean framed each moment like punctuation, constant, forgiving, infinite. The director asked me to revisit Ridgeview for a closing scene. I resisted at first, arguing that I'd already said everything I needed to. But he insisted that returning wasn't about reopening old wounds. It was about showing where silence begins before it breaks. He was right, of course. So, one gray morning, I found myself standing again at the edge of the old town square. The same cobblestones that had once seemed to echo with judgment now softened by drizzle. We filmed quietly, no script, just presence. The camera captured me walking past the church, the bakery, the post office, all still there, though smaller, worn around the edges. When we reached the hill overlooking the Hayes estate, I stopped. The new owners had repainted the shutters navy blue, planted lavender along the walkway. It looked peaceful, almost gentle, a life rebuilt atop the foundations of control. I felt no bitterness, only distance. Time, I realized, doesn't erase pain. It simply redefines the scale on which we measure it. The final shot was filmed by the sea back in Brighton Bay. I stood beside the windows of the studio as waves struck the rocks below. The director asked what I would say to the younger version of myself, the girl who had left Ridgeview with nothing but a sketchbook and defiance. For a long moment, I couldn't answer. Then I said, I wouldn't tell her to forgive anyone. I'd tell her to hold on long enough to meet the woman she would become. Because survival isn't about forgetting. It's about outgrowing the need to be understood by those who never tried. When the documentary aired months later, I didn't watch it live. I went walking instead, along the beach at dusk. The tide was high and cold. I felt the salt cling to my skin like memory. Back home, messages poured in, emails, letters, voice recordings from people around the world. A woman in Canada wrote that she had reconciled with her estranged mother after 20 years. A man from India said he finally understood his daughter's silence. The film had done what I alone could not. It turned a personal scar into collective language. But even light has its shadow. Fame, however quiet, brings proximity to pain. Strangers sent stories so heavy I sometimes struggled to read them. People began visiting the studio unannounced, leaving notes under the door, small gifts, photos of lost parents or estranged children. It was beautiful and overwhelming, a reminder that once you speak truth aloud, you become a vessel for others who cannot yet. I learned to accept the weight gently, to remember that I was not their savior, only proof that healing was possible. One evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, I went through old files for the first time in years, letters, sketches, receipts from the days when I had fled Ridgeview. Among them was an unopened envelope, yellowed with time. The postmark read 2009, the year after I left home. It was from my mother. I had found it once before and tucked it away, too afraid to read it. But that night, I opened it. Her handwriting was unsteady. She wrote that she hoped I was safe, that she had seen one of my early paintings in a local newspaper, that she wished she had known how to love differently. The letter ended with a single line. If silence is our inheritance, I pray you spend yours better than I did. For the first time in years, I cried, not with anger, but with something softer. Maybe forgiveness, maybe grief, maybe both. I placed the letter beside my desk, next to the photograph of the first workshop at the salvage. They belonged together, the past that broke me and the present that rebuilt me. Outside, the sea continued its rhythm, unconcerned with legacy or loss. In that steady sound, I heard what I had been searching for all along, not closure, but continuity. Life didn't stop with forgiveness. It kept unfolding, quietly, bravely, endlessly. Sometimes, when I look back on the years between Ridgeview and now, it feels like watching someone else's life through glass, close enough to see, too distant to touch. The woman I've become doesn't quite recognize the girl who once trembled in her parents' hallway, rehearsing apologies for existing outside their blueprint. But in certain moments, I still feel her. A faint pulse beneath everything I do. She isn't gone. She's just quieter now, replaced by someone who finally learned the difference between endurance and peace. The documentary changed things in ways I couldn't have predicted. Invitations arrived from universities, art collectives, even policy groups wanting to discuss intergenerational silence, as though it were a condition to be cured. People wanted answers, frameworks, solutions. But life doesn't work in diagrams. It unfolds in layers, contradictions, half-healed wounds. My story was never about triumph. It was about acceptance, about learning to live with the pieces you can't fix and finding beauty in the cracks that remain. I started spending more time alone again, not in isolation, but in restoration. Mornings became slow rituals, coffee, salt air, the hum of waves. I began painting smaller works, intimate ones. No exhibits, no press, just color and texture that felt honest. One piece, a small canvas washed in gray and gold, I titled Inheritance. I didn't sell it. It hangs above my desk, a quiet reminder that what we inherit isn't just pain, but also the capacity to transmute it. Every so often, Nathan calls. Our conversations are brief, careful, polite. He sends photos of his children, my niece and nephew, smiling in ways we never did. I keep the pictures in a small wooden box, the same one that once held my sketches. When I look at their faces, I feel something close to hope. Maybe healing doesn't always arrive in our own generation. Sometimes it skips ahead, finding more open soil to grow in. Ridgeview still reaches out occasionally. They named an art scholarship after me last year, one for students pursuing creative fields, born of personal truth. I accepted the gesture, not for validation, but because I wanted to give young people the chance I never had. I wrote the scholarship's guiding statement myself: create what is true, even when it makes others uncomfortable. The committee approved it without edits. That, in itself, felt like quiet justice. One afternoon, I returned to the studio to find the sea unusually calm. The tide was low, revealing the black rocks below the windows like bones surfacing through skin. It reminded me that beauty and pain often share the same tide. Inside, the light caught on the bronze plaque near the entrance. For every unspoken. I ran my fingers along the letters, their surface cool and solid beneath my hand. I had written those words years ago, but only now did I fully understand them. They weren't a dedication to those who couldn't speak. They were a promise to keep listening. That night I stayed late, sorting through letters sent after the documentary. Most were simple thank yous, but one stood out. It came from a woman in her 50s who wrote that she had estranged herself from her controlling parents decades ago, and for the first time, she no longer felt guilty for choosing distance. She ended her message with a sentence that lingered long after I finished reading. Your peace gave me permission to stop apologizing for mine. I think that's what healing ultimately becomes, not loud redemption or cinematic closure, but quiet permission. The permission to stop performing pain. The permission to rest without guilt. The permission to live a life unshaped by someone else's expectations. Sometimes I walk the shoreline just before dawn, when the world feels half asleep and honest. The air smells like salt and morning, and the water glows faintly with the reflection of the rising light. I often think of my parents then, not with anger, but with a kind of detached compassion. They were people molded by fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of what others might whisper if love wasn't perfectly arranged. It doesn't excuse what they did, but it explains it. And understanding, I've learned, is a different kind of closure. one that doesn't erase the past, but releases its hold. If revenge was ever part of my story, it ended the moment I stopped wanting to prove anything. True revenge, I discovered, isn't destruction, it's evolution. It's waking up one morning realizing you no longer carry their voices in your head, that your peace no longer depends on their acknowledgement. It's becoming someone who no longer needs the world that once dismissed you. Now, when people ask what happened to the Hayes family, I tell them it's simple. The house fell, but something else stood in its place. Something freer, quieter, and infinitely more real. I am what remains when the noise fades, and that's enough. Before I end, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after losing the people you thought would stand by you? If you have, I hope my story reminds you that survival doesn't have to look like victory. Sometimes, it just looks like finally breathing without permission. Thank you for listening. And remember, peace is not found. It's chosen. Every single day.